never really entertained the idea of leaving Sweden, not until I was 20 years old. It was love that did it. You see, on vacation on one of the beautiful Greek islands, I met an American guy. Mark was serving in the US Army stationed in Greece, and he and I met during one of his weekends off duty. It wasn't exactly love at first sight, but to make a long story short, we were married a few months later. It was Mark who introduced me to Unitarian Universalism. When he did, it was a freeing experience. It was as if a locked door had swung open and I could enter into a more meaningful life and existence. My first 10 years in the US were mostly about assimilating to a new culture and finding my way around. I don't remember interacting much with people of color, though I do remember my mother-in-law showing me around in Charlottesville, Virginia, where she lived, and how shocked I was to see the difference between white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods. All this time, I was, of course, taking in covert racism without knowing it. Coming to America, which I did, by the way, on February 22nd, 1974, has been quite a journey of learning about race and racism and white privilege. It's been like peeling an onion, and at times tears filled my eyes and ran down my cheeks. Of course, it hurts. Once, as a lay leader who planned the worship services at the UU Fellowship, I was confronted about my choice of reading selections. I had asked a member of the congregation to do an Uncle Remus story, Brer Rabbit. I think it was February, Black History Month. Bill did a great job telling the story, but right after, it was made clear in no uncertain terms to me, to Bill, and to all in attendance that Uncle Remus stories are offensive, full of stereotypes, and not representative of Black people. I was horrified and utterly embarrassed. It was a painful learning experience, but a needed one. A few years later, the Ku Klux Klan were coming to our town, Stanton, Virginia. It was 1987. While some people preferred to ignore the KKK presence and stayed at home, many of us lined the street along the route, holding placards and signs protesting the KKK and racism. It was a profound experience, one that helped me understand the depth of racism and that it was a cultural and social institution. 1987 was also the year I began to serve on the then Thomas Jefferson District of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And it was not long before I began attending the TJ District's annual anti-racism conferences. That first wall of history is forever etched in my mind, but there was so much more. During those conferences, I heard heart-wrenching stories about racism. One of those made a deep impression on me. A Black woman told us about coloring as a young child with crayons, you know, Crayola crayons. She pulled out one in particular, peach, maybe a lighter shade than that, but it was identified as skin, not her skin. No, of course it hurts. At the 1993 General Assembly in Charlotte, North Carolina, a whole day had been set aside for racial justice programming. It took place after the TJ birthday ball debacle. The Racial Justice Day began with Dr. Cornel West speaking. His book, Race Matters, had been published that spring. I was mesmerized by both his presence and his message. When I departed from Charlotte, I had his book, Race Matters, in my bag. It was about that time that I became creating a Jubilee World anti-racism trainer. We were always 4 trainers at these weekend workshops, always a Black man and Black woman, a white man and white woman. And we worked closely together to plan activities and who would lead what. In 1994, when I entered seminary at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago, Mel Hoover, who was then on staff at the UUA, hooked me up with Joseph Barnt, an American Lutheran pastor and anti-racism activist who co-founded Crossroads Ministry, a Chicago-based racial justice advocacy group. I learned a lot volunteering at Crossroads and being in the midst of wonderful, competent, passionate, justice-seeking men and women. Other than Joe Barnt, I was the only white person. The layers of the onion were peeling away, but my thinking during this time was something like, well, Barbro, you did not grow up in this country with a history of slavery and racism. Naturally, you're not racist. Ha. That changed during that first year in seminary when I read another Cornel West book, Prophecy Deliverance. In a section about the genealogy of racism, West wrote about Carl von Linné, the famous 18th century Swedish botanist and naturalist, and how Linné was one of the very first to categorize human beings into distinct races. I quote, "For Linnaeus, there were 4 races: Homo europaeus, Homo asiaticus, Homo afar, and Homo americanus." It is quite apparent that Linnaeus implicitly evaluated the observable characteristics of the racial classes of people. For example, compare Linnaeus's description of the European with the African. European, white, sanguine, brawny, hair abundantly flowing, eyes blue, gentle, acute, inventive, covered with close vestments, governed by customs. African, black, phlegmatic, relaxed, hair black, frizzled, skin silky, nose flat, lips tumid, crafty, indolent, negligent, anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. End of quote. If that is not racism, I don't know what is. Established by a fellow Swede. It floored me. Wrestling with that new knowledge was agonizing. But that is when I finally began to understand that I had grown up in a society with institutionalized and systemic racism woven into its very fabric. And that I have been influenced by centuries-old cultural messages that people with white skin are superior. Of course, it hurts. And yes, it has been challenging and painful to comprehend the complexities of culture and racism. It is very much like peeling an onion with multiple layers of innocence, ignorance, denial. I have taken for granted the white privilege norms, values, and assumptions I grew up with. I return often to that image I shared earlier, standing in front of the wall of history and noting the relationship between racial justice and racism. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that we are now experiencing a leviathan of racism. It has been there all along, sometimes overt, sometimes covert. Right now, it takes the form of white backlash. The process of becoming aware, of opening our eyes and ears and hearts and minds to deeper understandings of racism and white supremacy is only a beginning. I applaud you, the congregation of the UU congregation of Greater Naples, for the decision to take a stronger stand in the social justice movement, focusing on racism and other oppressions. To dismantle institutional and systemic racism and to end white supremacy will take all of us doing our part, and it is my hope that we, Unitarian Universalists, will live our shared values, be intentionally engaged, and work together for racial justice. May it be so.